Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar titled The Whole Farm Approach to Natural Capital. We've got quite a few people signed up, I think over 100, and I think I'm just trying to keep a running total. There's about 30 people in now. So we are expecting more to arrive, perhaps not to get to that 100 total, but we're going to make a start anyway, because we've got a fair bit to get through. So yeah, this is the project conclusions webinar for a FIRNS project that we've been running over the last 10 months, which we submitted the final report for a couple of weeks ago, kindly funded by Nature Scott and the National Heritage Lottery Fund. And it's under the Facility for Investment Readiness Nature Scotland programme that's been running for a couple of years now. So we thought it would be useful, although it wasn't a project requirement, we thought it would be useful to run a project conclusions webinar. We've engaged with a lot of people over the last 10 months, some of whom we've already been able to share some of the information with at a project conclusions workshop. But we thought we'd do something a bit wider than that with this webinar that we're running for the next hour and a half. So we have until 12 if we need it. Yeah, as I say, welcome. And I should have introduced myself by now because I've already been speaking for a couple of minutes. So my name's Clive Thomas. I work as a senior advisor in the farming and land use team at the Soil Association. And the reason that I'm talking first is that I've been project managing this project on behalf of the wider partnership. The Soil Association has been the lead partner for this project, but we've been working with our other funded partners, the Woodland Trust, Finance Earth, and our certification colleagues in the Soil Association, so Soil Association certification. And you'll be hearing from all four organisations this morning as we take you through some of our findings and our conclusions and our thoughts on next steps. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I turn to the webinar proper. So we have the Q&A enabled for this webinar, but also the chat. We very much would appreciate if you could try and sort of stick to the idea of the chat being used to ask questions, any technical questions about the webinar, or to post links that might be relevant to anything we're saying, or to kind of engage with each other, or to make observations. But if you have questions for any of the speakers or any of the team that's presenting today about the project, if you could put those in the Q&A, and we'll come to those at the end of the webinar. There's a facility to upvote those questions, so we'll do our best when we come to that to deal with them in order, in terms of the ones that have of most interest to you all. Okay, you've all come in as muted, that you do have the facility to unmute yourself, and that might be something we want to do in the Q&A if it's easier to ask a question specifically. But at the moment, if you could keep yourselves muted while we're presenting, because we're going to be taking you through some slides, that would be appreciated. Okay, so yeah, that's the sort of introduction and the housekeeping. Okay, so it's not just going to be me speaking. We're going to be taking you through, as I say, some information that we've generated from the project and some conclusions, and I will briefly introduce, I guess, the sort of context for the project and the sort of main things that we've focused on. As you'll appreciate, in an hour and a half webinar, we're not going to be able to do full justice to the project. So we're going to focus on some specific aspects around the whole farm approach, as we call it. And the first two people we'll be hearing from when we do that section will be Johanna Norris. Johanna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I also work for the Soil Association charity as an advisor for natural capital markets, and I've been employed here since the beginning of this FIRNS project since last May.
Thanks, Johanna. And then Johanna will be doing a bit of a double act with Ian. So Ian, would you like to introduce yourself?
I think his sound might have dropped off, but he should be coming in again soon.
Okay, we'll come back to Ian. So John, you're next on the agenda.
Good morning. So I'm John, the Development Manager in the Climate and Landscape team at Soil Association Certification, and I'll be speaking to some of the validation outputs from the pilot assessments that we undertook as part of this project.
Thank you, John. Jamie, are you there?
I'm here, Clive. Good morning, everyone. Jamie Ferrer-Scott. I'm an Associate Director here at Finance Earth. We are an environmental impact advisory and fund management business, and we've been in charge of doing some of the financial analysis, both on 3 of the 5 sites and also at a whole farm level.
Thanks, Jamie. Have we got Ian yet? No. Okay. Hopefully Ian will be able to sort out his technical challenges, and we'll give him a chance to introduce himself when he's presenting some of his slides in a moment. So as you can see from the agenda, we're going to give you, as I say, a quick introduction to the project. You'll then be hearing from us about how we had sort of took forward this idea of the whole farm approach to natural capital planning, and some of the sort of different elements and dimensions of that. As John has said, John will then be talking about the validation and verification of whole farm projects, and also when we group farms together into groups of farms or aggregation of farms. And then Jamie will be doing a similar job, looking at that from a sort of financial analysis perspective. And then I'll come back in at the end of those presentations to give you some of our sort of headline conclusions and I guess some of the sort of take-home messages and next steps that we think need to be taken forward to kind of progress this agenda. And hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, so what was really the sort of purpose of our project? What were we trying to think about in this project? And I guess, you know, the sort of context for this really is many of you on the webinar will appreciate that the whole idea of nature markets, voluntary nature markets, is quite embryonic. It's still developing. It can be quite complex and sort of quite transactional in terms of the costs of engaging with those nature markets, in terms of trying to sort of develop natural capital, to develop new ecosystem services, and to kind of monetize those and get investment. So that's the kind of first issue that we were trying to think about, but we were really looking at this through the lens of small and medium-sized farms, and that kind of added complexity of engaging with those nature markets that's kind of inherent with a small and medium-sized enterprise that has generally low capacity in terms of time, is focused on other things, primarily farming and food production. And you know, the sort of evidence to date is that nature markets have been generally more successful with bigger projects where there's been a sort of wholesale change of land use. So what might have been a farmed landscape previously has become a wooded landscape or a nature landscape, where they're the sort of primary outputs. But what we really wanted to explore in this project was how small and medium-sized farms, which make up about 25% of the farmed area in Scotland, 25% of the farms in Scotland are less than 200 hectares, and as I say, that amounts to about 23% of the farmed area. How can that area of Scotland also contribute to developing natural capital and accessing nature markets, given that complexity, given some of those kind of inherent challenges of small projects, and also given the sort of challenge of trying to do this in a co-production way where food production still remains an important priority for those landscapes. So there were the sort of barriers that we were trying to think about, and I guess that sort of overall context. And we really adopted 2 main sort of, I guess, ideas to explore how to address those barriers and help bring more of that farmed landscape into this nature market environment. So the first idea was to think about the whole farm. So, you know, the way nature markets and sort of voluntary codes and carbon credits in particular, but also to some extent biodiversity, nature markets have developed to date have been around sort of specific habitats or specific codes, but we wanted to think about how all of those could be thought about at the whole farm level, effectively as a sort of single project, but also crucially how that would be integrated into a carry-on farming model rather than a replacing farming model, and ideally in the scenario of actually supporting the farming system in terms of food production, but also the overall resilience of the farm enterprise. So that was the sort of first aggregation idea, and that's the one we're going to focus mostly on in this webinar. But we then did go on to do some work looking at the idea of grouping those whole farms together into either groups, clusters, networks, and the 5 core farms that we've worked with under that first sort of objective, we have created a hypothetical group. Although they're distributed across Scotland, they're not spatially congruent. We've still used that data and that sort of analysis to think about that as a hypothetical group and try and draw some conclusions about the financial and validation benefits of a group model as well. We also carried out some wider, what you might call social research, to investigate the sort of opportunities for groups, clusters, networks to support delivery. And that has informed some of our conclusions, which you'll hear about towards the end of the webinar. Okay, so what we're going to do kind of in the bulk now is take you through these steps. So as I briefly mentioned, we've worked with 5 core farms and also a croft in Scotland, and I should have said this by now, but all of our sort of conclusions and all of the information we'll be presenting is equally applicable to a sort of croft scenario as it is to a small and medium-sized farm. So we're going to take you through the first step, which is how we sort of thought about a whole farm natural capital project development, and we're going to use a couple of the 5 farms that we worked with as examples to present that to you. We're going to look at that in terms of how those could be sort of how that sort of aggregation opportunity works at the whole farm level, and then we're going to be looking at that specifically through the lens of, as I said, the validation and verification opportunities and then the sort of financial opportunities. So that's when you'll be hearing from the other speakers. Now we've decided for this webinar that we just have, rather than, as you can tell already, there's going to be quite a few of us speaking. We've decided just to have one set of slides rather than lots of resharing of screens. It's a bit of a trade-off because the speakers are going to have to tell me when to move slides, but I hope you can bear with that, and that's less disruptive than changing screens all the time. So without further ado, I will move on to step 1 and hand over to Johanna.
Thank you very much. So this was the first stage in developing a whole farm approach. First of all, we had to find farms or areas to work with, and we had a few criteria for farms that we were looking for in Scotland, primarily based on size, the small and medium size category. So we ended up with 5 farms in Scotland who were between 48 hectares and 232 hectares in size. But there were also some other elements, such as their future farming goals, aims to continue food production alongside enhancing natural capital assets on their farm. And then, as Clive mentioned previously, we also had a case study with one croft, just to capture some perspectives from the crofting community, including aspects such as common grazing committees. Of course, farms can develop their own natural capital plans, but in this instance, we had Woodland Trust as project partners, so they acted as project developers. helping the farmers to realise their future farming goals alongside natural capital. So that was mostly based on developing tree-based plans. But we also wanted to capture some other elements beyond just carbon. So to get an idea of the current farming practices on each of the farms, we had each farm complete a whole farm baseline using the Soil Association Exchange platform. We did consider some other apps that are available to do this. We know that there's lots of different tools out there, but we were familiar with the Soil Association Exchange, and some of the farms had already been through this process before. So that's a mixture of survey data from the farmer themselves, but also on-site sampling around soils and biodiversity to get a picture of the current farm over 6 different impact areas. And then lastly, the aim was to create natural capital plans based on the steps above. And this included carbon calculations using tools like the Woodland Carbon Code, Carbon Calculator. We used that to make the carbon calculations for the woodlands, as well as silvopasture, where there was a minimum of 400 stems per hectare, sorry, maximum of 400 stems per hectare for silvopasture scenarios. And then we used 2 other tools developed by the Organic Research Centre. One for hedgerows that was developed during the first round of FIRNS funding led by Soil Association. That was between October and March last year. And then a agroforestry carbon calculator to capture carbon sequestered by silvo-arable systems that some of the farms wanted to develop. And that was a carbon calculator created during a NERF-funded project a few years ago, whilst creating an agroforestry carbon code. So if we move on, we'll introduce one of the farms, one of the 5 farms who participated in this project. This is Lumfinnen's farm. It's based in Fife, and this is a screenshot from the Soil Association Exchange platform. So you can see the different land cover types that currently exists for this farm. So it's 142 hectares in size. The little green bit at the top of that circle is space for nature. So we can see here that most of this land is really in grassland use, and there's not that much space for nature. And that's also reflected by the scores you can see on the right-hand side of the screen across the 6 different impact areas of the Soil Association Exchange. So if we look into one in particular, if we look at the carbon impact area, we can see that the score is quite low, and that's due to the fact that most of this farm is under livestock use, and the fact that there are very few existing trees and hedgerows on site. So that was kind of viewed as one potential area of improvement where a lot of natural capital assets could be generated. And if we move on to the next slide, I hope my colleague Ian Laidlaw from the Woodland Trust has made it back into the meeting so that he can explain a bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, a few technical problems there, but I think I'm back. Yeah, thanks, Joanna. So, so this is a couple of photographs of Lumfinnen's farm in Fife, just to give you an idea of the area we are looking at. So if you look at the photograph on the right, that's looking from the steading into the centre of the farm, looking sort of west-northwest. You'll see there's one beautiful tree in the middle there, and I think there's only a handful of trees on the farm, as Joanna said. But it does give you an idea of the potential there. It's a lovely, healthy-looking ash, I think. Obviously pretty well grown. And you can see some trees away in the background, but they're all on neighbouring properties, usually just over the boundary. So yeah, next to no trees or hedges on the farm. As you see, a little bit of gorse on the hillside on the left. There's a little bit of gorse on some of the drier slopes on the farm, and they're the sort of areas that we were targeting for native woodland creation. So the less productive agriculturally areas where we were focusing most of the tree planting, certainly the traditional native woodland planting as opposed to the agroforestry. And the second photograph on the left there, again, just a little bit further into the farm, looking more northwest. Again, you can see trees in the background, but all over the boundary on neighbouring property. And if you can just picture that, if you can see that pylon running through the middle, when we move on to the next map, you'll be able to sort of locate where we are on the farm. But those sort of better grassland fields are some of the areas where we were looking at agroforestry, so silver pasture, where we're planting trees but also retaining the grazing. So that's that's just to give you an idea of what we're looking at Lumfinans. It's in Fife. It's in the old coal mining area, between, for those of you who know that part of the world, between Cowden, Beath and Lochgelly. And so in terms of the details of what we worked up, so I've got, so Charles Eakins is the farmer, the owner there, fairly recent acquisition for Charles, Lumfinans farm, and Charles worked with my colleague Ian Moss in our outreach team to work up plans for potential woodland creation, agroforestry and hedgerows across the farm. So it's total area of the farm is about 140 hectares. And as we said, there's next to no trees on the place. So Charles's sort of objectives, if you like, in a nutshell, is rewilding with food production. So because there's next to nothing there, we're looking for some fairly significant areas of woodland creation and agroforestry and hedges in relation to the total area of the farm. So woodland, 36.8 hectares net, mostly in deer fencing, inverted mounds, vole guards, and relatively dense planting. 1,600 is the sort of minimum for the out and out native woodland, but we're up to over 2,500 per hectare for some of the woodland planting, which is aimed at being more productive. So if you look at the map on the right, the 36.8 hectares of woodland creation are the brown areas. The light brown is more conventional native woodland, mixed native species at 1,600 per hectare, and then the dark brown up over 2,500 stems per hectare. So we're aiming for something a bit more productive there. That's mostly oak and birch, at up to 3,100 stems per hectare, but certainly up over 2,500 on average across the dark brown areas. And the net result of that is quite a significant quantity of carbon. I should mention the plan for the productive woodlands, the dark brown areas on there, they're in to be thinned and managed potentially for timber production, but more than 100 years ahead before there'd be any clear felling, and that thinning does reduce the amount of carbon a wee bit, but obviously potentially you generate some income long term from the timber production. So anyway, significant quantity of carbon in the woodland, up over 14,000 PIUs. I should mention that's pending issuance units in tons of CO2 equivalent. So basically woodland carbon units in tons of CO2 equivalent. And the P is really, I tend to use that because this is all potential over the 100 years. But significant quantities, knocking on for 400 tons per hectare, carbon units per hectare. Agroforestry, so that's the grey areas, the grey fields in the middle of the map, 15 hectares, silver pasture, so that's grazing in amongst the trees, but a relatively high stocking for agroforestry, 400 trees per hectare, which equates to 5 meters by 5 meters spacing, So that is the higher rate for forestry grant scheme agroforestry. And at that higher rate, that also means it's eligible for the the existing woodland carbon code. So the again significant quantities of carbon in that, not as much as the denser conventional woodland planting, but still worthwhile amounts of carbon, up over 3,000 PIUs or tons of CO2, 200 odd per hectare. So significant carbon in that agroforestry, even though it's still going to be grazed. That's grazed woodland. And then a lot of hedges, again, which are the dotted blue lines, if you can see them on the map. Nearly 4 kilometres of hedges, traditional sort of mostly thorn with a mixture of broadleaf species, 2.5 metre wide. And if you multiply that 2.5 metres by the 3,850, you get to about 1 hectare net. So actually, the tons per hectare are quite high in the hedge, but because it's obviously such a small net area, total PIUs less than 500. So not huge quantities of carbon in the hedge. Next slide, I think, Clive. I think we're back to you, Joanna?
Yeah, so I mentioned before that this exchange platform is currently a good baselining tool, but we also tested out the future image potential for Lumfinnen's farm. So we created a dummy profile in the exchange to generate this view. So this is an overlay of the woodland and tree planting and hedge planting plans that Ian just showed within the Exchange app. So you can see that Space for Nature, for example, is shot up quite a bit. So that's that green line in the circle. And if you click one more time, Clive, you can also see for each farm, we did a qualitative evaluation of what might change across the farming business as a result of the natural capital plans. So that was just to get an idea of the possible benefits, but also potential negative side effects that the natural capital plans that were created by the Woodland Trust might have on the 6 impact areas across the Soil Association Exchange. So if we go on to the next slide, yep, the second example we've chosen here is Parkhill Farm. Parkhill is also based in Fife. The other farms and croft that we had participating in the project are scattered all over Scotland, so from Skye to Aberdeenshire to Dumfries and Galloway. And Parkhill Farm is quite interesting in that they have already implemented some silvo-arable agroforestry on their land. So they planted some apple trees within barley fields, and you can see here that generally the scores are quite good on the right-hand side on the Exchange platform, but they're still the farmers still keen to add more natural capital to the land in the form of more woodlands and some more silvo-arable fields, as well as some hedgerows. So I'll pass on to you again, Ian, for that.
Thanks, Johanna. So a couple of photographs just to give you an idea of what we're looking at Parkhill. So the photograph on the left, water, you can see that's the Tay estuary. And I guess looking away in the distance, if it was a better photograph, you might just about see Dundee. And behind us, we've got Newborough. So this is the nice green field on the slope. In the middle of the picture is the area that's in for proposed woodland creation. You can see there's a bit of gorse just centre left in that field. It doesn't really come up so well in the photograph, but it's pretty steep, which is why it isn't arable. All that nice arable stuff down in the bottom next to the Tay is what most of the farm looks like. And then you've got this steep hillside rising along the southern boundary of the farm. And the woodland creation stretches away. You can just see a little bit of gorse away in the far distance next to an existing woodland strip on the right. So that's the far end of the proposed woodland creation. And then on the right, this is the really interesting thing at Parkhill. This is a bit of existing alley cropping, I think you can call this. So these are apple trees running along that. Was actually a wildflower strip in the autumn, I think. So Roger's already done some of this planting of apple trees. The trees in the rows going away from you there, well, in that single row, 3 metre spacing along the row in a wildflower strip. Roger might correct me, of about 3 metres wide, I think. And then away on the left-hand edge, you'll just see, if you can just about make it out, another line. So that's the next line of apple trees, which is about 27 metres away. So you've got this arable strip At about 27 meters, and with the wildflower strip. So roughly speaking, the rows of apple trees are about 30 meters apart. So 3 meters in the row, 30 meters apart, which actually results in quite a low sort of stocking density, as you can imagine. Next slide, I think, Clive. So here we are in terms of what my colleague sorry, I've got these ones mixed up. Actually, it was Charlie Owen, my colleague, who did all the work with Charles at Lumfinans, and it's Ian Owen here. Ian Moss, my colleague in the Woodland Trust. He did a lot of the work here with Roger Howison, the owner. So that yellow block, if you like, on the map, W11, that's the woodland type. So that was that green strip, looking along the hillside. And then the pink lines to the left, that's the proposed alley cropping with apple trees, with an arable strip between, similar to the stuff that Roger's already planted. I don't know, it was about 5 or so years ago in the previous photograph. So back to the plans. Total farm a little bit bigger than Lumfinans, 210 hectares. But Roger's already done quite a bit of woodland planting over the last few years, and there were some older woodlands on the farm. So not quite so much scope for big areas of new woodland because of the existing woodland and also the existing agroforestry to some extent. So we're proposing that yellow block is about 8.5 hectares net up on the hillside, mostly oak and birch. It's good tree growing ground again. Inside a deer fence, inverted mounds with vole and rabbit guards. There's a bit of a rabbit issue, particularly with the gorse. We're intending to leave the gorse and plant around it. There's already a bit of natural regen coming through the gorse, but relatively high levels of carbon per hectare, over 500 tons CO2 equivalent per hectare. So nearly 4,500 PIUs. So good growing ground. We're going for conventional native woodland here, so no thinning, no clear felling. So that does boost up the carbon units per hectare, without the thinning. And then the agroforestry, which is the pink lines on the map, that's the apple trees. Because although they're 3 meter spacing in the row, big wide gap between the rows with the arable strips, and that gets you to less than 150 trees per hectare, which is below the minimum for FGS agroforestry grant and is well below the minimum for the Woodland Carbon Code currently. So that's where we go through one of these draft carbon calculators to come up with a very low figure, not surprisingly, of 98, nearly 100 PIUs. So yeah, not surprising. The small stature fruit trees at very wide spacing, in effect. So relatively little carbon in that sort of agroforestry, but plenty of apples. So which is obviously one of the interests for Roger in terms of producing a crop and certainly converting some of that into cider. And then hedges, again, significant, but not quite as many new hedges proposed as at Lumfinans, but nearly 1 kilometre. But again, relatively, because of the low net area, not much more than 50 tons of CO2 in there. And I think that's back to you, Joanna.
Yep. So this leads us on to the second stage, based on the data that we gathered together with the farmers on their potential natural capital plans going into the future to assess the opportunities for aggregation. So my colleagues John and Jamie will speak to that, but here's a summary of the 5 farms and the Crofts plans. And you can see here in the totals columns what that means or what it looks like to aggregate across the whole farm. So that's each of the interventions from woodland through to silvo arable. And you can see that does boost the overall area of each of the planting plans. And then in the bottom, you can see that if the farms were to be grouped together individually, based on singular interventions, so for woodland, we can see that the total is 113 hectares, which obviously has a much larger impact than just the one farm going forward individually. And this does imply possible cost savings for validation and finances, which John and Jamie will speak to in just a moment. But on a wider scale, the exchange platform also allows some analysis to be made of the wider benefits associated with planting woodland, as well as hedgerow, as well as the agroforestry options, rather than just viewing the interventions in an isolated manner. So I'll pass over to my colleague John now.
Thanks, Johanna, and thanks, Ian. Just before, John, I invite you to present your slides. I know we've had a few people join us, I think, after the sort of introduction. So just to, and I can't actually see what's going on in the Q&A or the chat because I'm sharing my screen, but just to kind of reiterate the idea for the Q&A after we've presented, if you could put your questions into the Q&A option within Teams and then leave the chat function for kind of other engagement that you might want to do with each other or links that you might want to post or any sort of technical queries that you're having. That would be appreciated. That will help us manage the Q&A later on. Okay, yeah, over to you, John, in taking us through the sort of aggregation opportunities from a validation and verification perspective.
Great stuff. Thank you, Clive. So just to start, a bit about who we are. So Soil Association Certification are an ISO accredited UK leading certification body. So we certify sustainable farming, land use and forestry and their related supply chains and commodities. In the climate and landscape team, our focus is on the voluntary carbon and ecosystem service markets, for which we are a validation and verification body, approved validation and verification body for the Woodland Carbon Code, for the Peatland Code, and for the Wilder Carbon Standard. Next slide, please, Clive. In terms of this project, our objectives as part of Workstream 1 were to develop a validation framework for whole farm natural capital, and then to apply that framework to 3 independent whole farm sites. So you've already heard bit about a couple of those sites. The sites that we were looking at were Park Hill and Lumfinans, that you've already heard about, and a third site, which was Castle St Innes. The second work stream, as Clive's already mentioned, was then to look at applying some analysis of the group governance options for whole farm natural capital. Next slide, please, Clive. So we started by developing a framework as part of that first objective, and to do that we needed to create a validation checklist. So we took the criteria from the Woodland Carbon Code and from the Peatland Code, and we aggregated it and we reviewed it for efficiencies to see where we could identify commonalities in the criteria that would enable us to look at a single means of validation. So kind of finding those efficiencies in alignment between the codes. We then added the criteria from the Agroforestry Code, which, as Johanna's already mentioned, is a non-published development code. It's output from a historic NERF-funded project. So we included that, and again, same process, looked to see where we could identify commonalities between the criteria so that we could minimise the need for more than one means of validation. For hedgerow carbon, there is no published criteria, but what we did have is the outputs from the first phase of this project, which gave us the hedgerow carbon calculator that the Organic Research Centre had developed. So we were able to use that in terms of assessing hedgerow carbon on site. Next slide, please, Clive. Already you've heard a bit today about Soil Association Exchange. The Soil Association Exchange wasn't used as the baselining tool for the validation assessment. So we were using the traditional mechanisms of the existing codes, so the Woodland Carbon Code, etc. What we did, because we created a combined checklist that had aggregated the different criteria, we wanted to make some efficiencies to the key documents which are used by project developers as part of the validation to evidence their compliance with the different code criteria. So we had a project design document that was an output from phase 1 of this project that included the criteria from the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, and we updated that and added some hedgerow and agroforestry criteria. And we also created a combined risk assessment, so having the interventions in a single risk assessment. Where possible, we also looked to see how we could share some of the existing key documents, again, to see if we could identify some efficiencies. So we looked at sharing budget and additionality calculators across agroforestry and Woodland Carbon Code. And we also looked at combining the carbon calculator using the agroforestry interventions within the Woodland Carbon Code calculator. Next slide. In terms of scope limitations, there are a few to go through. First of all, these are all hypothetical scenarios, so no projects have been formally validated as part of these pilot assessments. And for that reason, we really did focus on the material aspects relating to greenhouse gas assertions. So we've not required the submission of some documentation and evidence that we might do as part of a formal assessment where it didn't have an impact on greenhouse gas assertions and where it wouldn't be practicable for Woodland Trust to do that. Probably the biggest scope limitation is around the absence of peatland habitats within this pilot assessment. So unfortunately, the project team were not able to identify a site that had all 4 interventions, so Peatland Code, Woodland Carbon Code, agroforestry and hedgerow. And as such, it hasn't been possible to undertake a pilot assessment that includes those peatland interventions. So what we did in response to that is to undertake an informal review by aggregating data sets from a related Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code project that exists on contiguous land to see how that might inform our validation conclusions. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of the validation process, just to quickly make a distinction between validation and verification. So validation is an assessment of the project plan, so what the project developer is going to do on site against the qualifying criteria. So that could be the Woodland Carbon Code, the Peatland Code, agroforestry criteria, etc. And that includes an assessment of the baseline and projected greenhouse gas assertions over the duration of the project. The verification then occurs at intervals after the validation, so year 5, year 10, and at different intervals following the validation, to confirm whether or not those projected claims had actually been delivered on the site. For obvious reasons, we're looking at the validation assessment as part of this project. And as you've already heard, Woodland Trust were acting in the role of project developer, and they were submitting the key documents to us for review. A validation is an iterative assessment process. So Woodland Trust would submit these documents to us. We would raise questions, identify where there isn't alignment with the criteria from the codes and ask for further information and amendments. Woodland Trust would then undertake a review of the documents, resubmit the information until we got to the point where we were satisfied that the information that they'd provided evidenced alignment with the code criteria. We also undertook site visits to each of the farms to ground truth some of this information as well. Once we'd got to the point of being able to complete the checklist and the key documents were finalised, we then considered the project to have reached that stage of being validated. Next slide, please. So what were the efficiencies and what worked well out of doing this validation process? The key thing for us that worked well was around the aggregation of the key documents. So rather than requiring project developers to submit separate project design documents for each of the interventions, we were able to combine that into a single PDD. Similarly, as I've already mentioned with the risk assessment, we were able to do the same. There were also opportunities to use the same carbon calculator for Woodland Carbon Code and agroforestry interventions to merge the cash flow calculator and to merge the mapping. All of those things added up to real-time efficiencies in the validation process, and they cascade down to the project developer. So there would be reduced project developer costs in terms of time because they would be able to put all of the interventions through predominantly on a single key documents rather than multiple key documents across schemes. This also has the benefit of having reduced data errors. So something that we see often as part of validation assessments is that there's a need to repeat the same information across more than one document. So you've got some information in the project design document, it's the same as what's in the carbon calculator, it's the same as what's in the management plan. Something then may change as part of the iterative process, and the project developer then needs to update all those documents in line with doing that, and that can create some inefficiencies in the process. And so by grouping them in this way and by designing the combined project design document, we were able to kind of minimize those areas of repetition which should lead to reduced data errors when information is being submitted to us for assessment. In terms of grouping the documents like this, it also gives enhanced visibility of the aggregated impact of a project. So somebody external is not needing to look at several different documents relating to each of the interventions. They're able to see things in one place, which also helps. So in terms of the incompatibilities and pinch points, and we'll look to unpack this a bit more in a moment, we did identify a few ways in which the two codes, particularly Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code, wouldn't work well if you overlap them. I think this is it's a bit of a given, really. They're both doing quite different things from a kind of carbon accounting and carbon calculating point of view. They're obviously looking at different things there, different eligibility criteria and different approaches to baseline. When you then add in the agroforestry interventions and the hedgerow interventions, it kind of doubles down on a lot of this, but also brings some of its own baggage as well. So we'll look to unpack some of these now. So if we could move on to the next slide. The first of those is around project duration and timeline, and we felt there was a real need to give consideration to the different intervention project start and finish dates and how that can best work to ensure permanence and avoidance of reversals. There are a few approaches that may work here. We looked at perhaps a rolling crediting period. We looked at perhaps the Woodland Carbon Code grouping mechanism to use the latest start date. But fundamentally, our feeling is that this shouldn't stop projects occurring if compliance is evidenced in line with the other criteria from the codes. So it's something that we're aware if we were to look at doing a whole farm aggregated project using the codes, it is something that would need to be considered and agreed upon. The next relates to financial additionality. Now, each of the where there is criteria, so for the agroforestry, for Peatland Code, for Woodland Carbon Code, they will have quite differing approaches to additionality requirements. But what makes it difficult is that the costs from an aggregated project are higher and cannot accurately or easily be determined on an intervention basis. So where they're putting fencing up, for example, it's not clear, should those costs be included under the Woodland Carbon Code element of the project? Should they be included under the Peatland Code element of the project or the agroforestry? And having it as a single calculation as an alternative then has the capacity to skew the outcome of the financial additionality test on a code-by-code basis. So there's a few things for us to consider here. One is, should costs be combined as part of the single cash flow or additionality calculator? And if so, what do we need to do differently for whole farm sites so that we can ensure that they meet the financial additionality criteria based on the combination of the different interventions? And again, any approach here would need agreement from the scheme owners. In terms of carbon calculators, already mentioned the option of maybe including the agroforestry as part of the Woodland Carbon Code calculator. There is an agroforestry carbon calculator. From our perspective, it's a really well-designed tool, but it does require a lot of inputs. So there's things like needing to measure local trees in a reference site. And we felt in some situations that would add a layer of complexity and additional resource for the project developer that we felt wouldn't necessarily be beneficial if similar results can be attained from using the Woodland Carbon Code calculator. There are limitations to that, of course. It would be a case of needing to develop that a bit further. But it did feel as though using the agroforestry calculator independently would actually be quite a kind of a time burden on project developers. The second part of this is the need for an agreement on required approach to buffer sizes required for the agroforestry intervention and the hedgerow carbon. As I've mentioned, there isn't any criteria around hedgerow carbon, so this would really need to be understood and agreed with the scheme owners. There are also just some, I won't go into too much detail on this point, but around the hedgerow calculator, there are certain fields that including things like target hedgerow height, width and cross direction that are completed by the project developer on the basis of the project developer's projection. But we feel there's a need there for consistency in reference data. So I think there'd be some feedback that we'd want to see taken on board around the hedgerow carbon calculator as well. I won't go into too much more detail on that. Consultation requirements is a big one. There are differing approaches to the Woodland Carbon Code and the Peatland Code, and thought is needed for a mechanism that enables project developers to undertake just one consultation that meets both of the code's criteria efficiently. And there are different ways that might be addressed. Consideration here was given to perhaps alignment with community benefit standards or the developing BSI Flex criteria as equivalent. Again, that would need agreement by the scheme owners. And then this is key. We've already talked about where we've seen the efficiencies. Now, as a validation and verification body, it was good for us to be able to engage with these documents and put the efficiencies in place that we think would work well. But fundamentally, that would need to be agreed by the scheme owners. They would need to have an alignment and an agreement in any combined key documents that would be used as part of a whole farm assessment. But we do think it's fundamental that those changes are made to enable validation efficiencies if you are looking at doing a whole farm assessment across multiple interventions. The next one is around carbon registries. So there'd be a need for consideration to how this could be accommodated within the registries across multiple interventions. And we also think there is a risk of it further complicating the requirement for scheme owner level checks across multiple interventions. We're already aware that there are efficiencies that could be introduced into this process. As I've mentioned already, it's an iterative assessment process from a validation and verification point of view that can take a number of months to complete. Adding to that, the requirement for scheme owner checks can then, even further kind of drag out the duration of the final validation being issued and projects being uploaded to the market registry. So we think there are efficiencies that can be identified there, and would be keen to work with the scheme owners to see what can be done. And then finally, I've already really mentioned this, but there isn't any formalised code criteria for agroforestry and hedgerow carbon. And for us to be confident that the greenhouse gas assertions relating to those interventions are accurate and have followed best practice, we'd need to know that there was sufficient governance over the ownership of those of that criteria. And that informed part of our strategic responses, overarching strategic responses that we'll look at as part of the project conclusions. Moving on to the second work stream around farm grouping, it was our feeling that looking at the kind of the grouping of Peatland Code and Woodland Carbon Code projects together, the issue there is that the grouping mechanism for the Woodland Carbon Code facilitates sampling of sites, so you don't need to visit each and every site and intervention, whereas the Peatland Code requires that all sites are visited, which could be accommodated, but our kind of consideration here is how affordable is that to look at all of the peatland on a site and only sample some of the Woodland Carbon Code. So we think for that reason that they're not broadly compatible from a grouping model. We do, however, feel that the agroforestry, hedgerow and woodland interventions could be assessed as part of a single project quite easily as part of the existing grouping mechanism for the Woodland Carbon Code. There are considerations here, so we'd need to give consideration to the pooling of carbon credits across different project developers potentially, and the issues that might therefore bring around. So finally, in terms of our questions in response to our outputs, first of those is, are Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code in their current iterations compatible as part of a single whole farm carbon assessment? We think there would be a need for further development there for it to work. And that brings us on to our second question there around what strategic changes are required to accommodate whole farm assessment that include all of these interventions. Finally, the other question that we've raised, and again is reflected in the conclusions from this project, is Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code whole farm assessment feasible based on supply? So the pilot was unable to identify any test sites that included all the interventions. So are there sufficient projects to make this worthwhile using Woodland Carbon and Peatland Carbon on a single farm site? That's me. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. And yeah, just to mention that the sort of picture we're building up here will come to the conclusions kind of across the whole project. So some of those things that John's just introduced there, you'll see repeated in our conclusions, and the final report goes into a lot more detail than we'll be able to in this webinar. But yeah, some of those sort of important conclusions about that supply side from a peatland code and woodland carbon code perspective has heavily informed one of our conclusions. Okay, without further ado, we'll move to the last of the sort of steps, step 4, which is looking at everything we've been doing through a sort of financial lens. So over to you, Jamie.
Thank you, Clive. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know who Finance Earth are, we are a social enterprise and offering environmental consultancy, investment advisory, fund management, and fund structuring advice. And our role on this project has been to look at the develop project cash flows for 3 of the 5 sites listed here, taking the data which has been referenced by the Woodland Trust and Soil Association colleagues earlier, and providing a viability of the different habitats. As mentioned in the Q&A, I can see PJ and Miranda in the Q&A have flagged that soil carbon in grasslands has not been included here. Our focus has been on woody biomass interventions, hence the soil carbon of grasslands has not been included at this stage, but we can pick that up at a later date in the Q&A later. So unsurprisingly, throughout this, the primary driver of woodland carbon units or carbon CO2e has been the woodlands. And across the 5 sites, the opportunity to generate in excess of 41,000 carbon units across woodland, agroforestry and hedgerow was assessed. Evidently, the larger the woodland, the higher the density of planting, the higher the carbon sequestration opportunity. And where silvo arable or silvo pasture was selected, as presented by Ian already, silvo arable has a much lower carbon opportunity, but has alternative benefits with alley cropping and revenues associated to the cider production linked to from the apples. It's Clive, if we can go on to the next slide, please. As mentioned at the start, we have analysed 3 of the 5 sites in detail and developed project cash flow models for these sites. So to assume a standard point of analysis, we've taken inflation in line with the OBR forecasts. We've used a common discount rate of 3.5%. We set some carbon pricing assumptions, which was to assume that a PRU price, so the pending issuance unit, was £30 in year 1, rising over time, and there was and that was capped out. I think we had a 2% growth to 2050, and we've assumed a premium for when the woodland carbon unit is validated, a premium and verified of 50% to the PRU price, so £45 starting. Where relevant, we've used woodland carbon models or the models referenced by the ORC, and we've input maintenance and capital contributions in line with Scottish Government FGS grants and BPS. We have not used the agri-environment schemes in this process for looking at hedgerow because that was deemed to be a competitive tender. And so we've looked at more hedges, which is the Woodland Trust opportunity for alternative hedgerow revenue. Next slide, please. So looking at the farm financial viability, you've got quite a broad spectrum here of the opportunity set, with Finnans farm being the most financially viable opportunity. All 3 sites would be positive cash flow from a woodland carbon perspective, and all 3 sites, the hedgerows, would not be viable as standalone basis. So there'll be some form of cross subsidization. Agroforestry for Finnans is a higher density woodland is silvo pasture, so the opportunity there, it would be cash flow positive. I think there was 3,000 carbon units to be generated on that, and like Park Hill, the silvo arable, much lower density. While there'll be very little carbon on there's been assumption that there'll be some income generated from cider and other opportunities. Across this, the cost of establishment is key to determining long-term viability. So where cactus guards have been used or vole guards, the cost differential between those has quite a material impact on the overall viability of the farm cash flow. With this also, the duration of the project is quite a key consideration as we can go on and look at the next few slides. So where the Woodland Carbon Code assumes 100 years, if one inflation adjusts validation and verification costs and maintenance costs over 100 years, you get some quite large cost figures in years 60 and 80, which do impact site viability. Next slide, please. Apologies that this slide seems to have come out in the wrong format. But what we're trying to show here is what the average break-even price is on an undiscounted basis over the lifetime of each of the three habitats. So in the bottom left, you can see Woodland. So Woodland, we have calculated as having a break-even price on a unit basis of £113 undiscounted. So this is the lifetime costs, inflation adjusted, divided by the total number of units. And that is obviously forecasting a break-even price of £113 on average. I think the cheapest being Lumfinens, and I've got more detail coming at that. For hedgerows and agroforestry, given the viability and the lower levels of carbon, it's not surprising to see much higher levels of break-even, with hedgerow the average break-even price being £474, and very much skewed by the cost of the Park Hill hedgerows. And then for agroforestry, again, the silver arable has skewed the cost of agroforestry break-even, and that's skewed by Park Hill. If one was to bundle the three, what I call biomass interventions of woodland, hedgerow, and agroforestry together, you'd get a combined break-even price over the 100-year project life of £122. Again, clearly, the woodland is dominating the overall break-even price here. I can go on and provide a bit more detail on this if on the next slide. So as mentioned before here, 100 years is a very long time to forecast any operating cash flow, and the inflation assumption of 2.5% makes a material impact on costs. So what I've tried to show here is that if one shortens the project life, what do break-even prices do, and are reflective of that. So starting on the left-hand side, we've got a 100-year break-even price, which is the working assumption, the Woodland Carbon Code. And as I mentioned for Woodland, that was £113, with a spread of £83 to £110 Lumfinens to Park Hill. Moving down to the shorter end of the project lifetime, so the 50-year break-even price would be on average £32 for woodland carbon units, or £52 on a bundled whole farm basis. And what's important about this is that Lumfinens has a break-even price of £9. If we're looking at the current market where PIUs are £30 in our model, that means that the average price is in line with current PIU price, which means that the total assessment is relatively viable. Evidently, Park Hill and Castle Cineas aren't as viable. It's dominated by Lumfinens, but we're highlighting here that on a shorter project life that PIU prices in the current market do make larger scale projects viable. On a 70-year basis, you can see this straddles between the two with a £58 break-even price. Next slide, please. So thinking about the aggregation of these habitat biomasses, these biomass habitats together, what are the implications? Now, if one was to take all three individual habitats and apply the Soil Association certification costs, which we've used here on to verify over the project life, each one would be in the region of £52,000 over the 100 years on an undiscounted basis. When one discounts, I think that comes down to more like £15,000. So a lot of the long-term opportunity is taken away by verification costs. So adding these together and working with the Soil Association, we agreed that there'll be a 1/3 saving on validation and verification, where all three can be assessed at the same time, subject to the alignment of documentation and processes set out by John. So aggregation clearly improves the viability for lower carbon habitats, which are often delivering co-benefits, so the hedgerows, and dilute some of the code issuance fees for these as well. But woodland is still the primary driver and the primary support mechanism when doing an aggregation across at whole farm level. Next slide, please. Now, the next thing we looked at was taking all the sites together. So this is the 5 sites, not just the 3 that we looked at in more detail, and assessing these as part of a group scheme. The assumption here was that we've got a group scheme of 5 to 9 members as a pricing point, and what impact would that make to the cost of verification. So after aggregating 5 farms in a single group scheme, whole farm validation and verification costs average 3% of total revenues. Now, clearly, that will depend on the volume of total credits generated across any one scheme, but this is an indication. We assess that a whole farm group scheme can achieve an average of 42% saving when combined, and hedgerows and agroforestry benefit the most from a cost saving perspective in terms of around a 66 and 46% fall. Again, even after those savings, they're still not viable because of the low levels of carbon that are generated by those two habitats. There are the other benefits of aggregation, the sharing of knowledge and facilitation of natural capital delivery at scale, especially when done at a landscape level or a contiguous level. But as John has just run through in a lot of detail, and this project has highlighted, there are certain limitations around operating a group scheme. In the Q&A, I'll be happy to pick up on any more of these calculations and the assumptions that we've made, but I hope that was quite clear in terms of the opportunity set and the financial analysis.
Thanks, Jamie. And yeah, thanks to all my colleagues for taking you through that detail. As you can see, I think in many ways the kind of level of detail that we've just presented actually makes some of the case for the project in the first place, in terms of the kind of the current complexity and the sort of small scale nature of individual projects on individual farms, particularly at the small and medium sized scale, you know, just being such a significant barrier to that portion of Scotland's farm landscapes, contributing to nature recovery and contributing to kind of wider ecosystem service delivery. So where did we get to? I guess as a kind of set of overall project conclusions, as I say, the final report, which runs to more than 70 pages, has got a lot more detail on this. And as I said at the start, we have worked beyond just these 5 core farms and the croft in terms of getting a wider set of inputs from the farming community and from a range of stakeholders who are either involved in natural capital projects or involved in some way in supporting the farming community in terms of kind of delivery of not just natural capital, but kind of wider services through some sort of grouping mechanisms. And we've also kind of considered the policy context in Scotland, where the move to kind of whole farm thinking and sort of whole farm support in terms of future farm support is a developing sort of policy arena as well. So this set of these 7 points on this slide tried to bring together some of the sort of key conclusions across the whole project. And this first one really around doing everything we've been talking about here at a whole farm level. Despite the added complexity of it, there are potentially some significant benefits to the farming system and also to the delivery of wider government policy. It's a way to help manage some of the trade-offs that can come through single interventions at single moments in time, and also to consider the sort of wider impacts as Johanna took you through the Soil Association Exchange, the way that you were able to baseline using a sort of set of metrics like that and consider impacts of changes that you might make on future wider impacts that are going to be delivered, including food production. So this is, from our perspective, this is definitely the way to be thinking about this, and one of the ways to scale small scale projects. And fortunately, we have been able to demonstrate that by adopting that sort of methodology that we've just outlined, there would be cost savings through aggregation, both at a whole farm and a group farm level. There's certain limitations that John and Jamie have outlined that would kind of shore up some of those cost savings, but the sort of fundamental conclusion is that aggregation is a way to be more efficient and a way to scale. Point 3 here. So we, as you can tell, we did some really detailed work on 5 farms, working with the individual farmers as to what they actually wanted to do, rather than it being a kind of top-down sort of policy idea that was applied to their farm. And a really interesting conclusion in terms of the agroforestry and also to some extent the hedgerows, that although kind of the Woodland Carbon Code has been around now for 15 years, doing a good job, many of the agroforestry systems that these farmers wanted to implement are currently eligible within the Woodland Carbon Code currently, but that's perhaps less well understood. In fact, it was less well understood by the project team until we actually did this work. So the sort of overall conclusion is that when you work at this kind of whole farm level, 90% of the carbon units that were generated in that bottom-up way already fit into an existing code, the Woodland Carbon Code. And we've already had discussions with Scottish Forestry about making that sort of clearer in sort of future communications. And then, as you've heard, the way of getting some of that lower density agroforestry and hedgerows potentially implemented where they're contributing a much lower proportion is through this sort of bundling idea and effectively a cross subsidy. Sort of broadening it out, we were very encouraged and kind of really quite optimistic actually about the what we've called the local delivery infrastructure or local delivery partnerships that already exist in Scotland, that could be mobilised. Some of them are already working in this kind of area around natural capital projects. Some of them are working on different themes with farmers, but there is a sort of ready-made set of partnerships that could be mobilised to do some of this aggregation. But sort of core elements for those local delivery partnerships were less to do with the exact governance model, whether they were sort of private focused or voluntary focused or NGO focused. They were more about having the centralised capacity, capability, and crucially facilitation, and that they weren't always focused on getting funding in to support that. But that is a constant challenge for those local delivery partnerships. So as I say, quite an optimistic conclusion that there is a sort of set of players, probably some people on this webinar, that could help bring to reality some of this kind of aggregation opportunity that we've outlined. Maybe less optimistically, and as I said at the start of this webinar, nature markets, particularly voluntary nature markets, it's very embryonic. And the kind of voluntary demand at the moment is currently insufficient in our sort of analysis, and quite uncoordinated to really drive the supply side from these smaller scale projects. At the moment, there's kind of sufficient bigger projects to meet that voluntary demand, but really to kind of leverage these smaller scale activities across this portion of Scotland's farm landscapes, there needs to be much more work done on generating the voluntary demand, which is well beyond the sort of scope of this project. And then a couple of other sort of further kind of things to watch out for, really. Codes and quite rightly, the sort of whole idea of nature markets is founded on high integrity. But we need to be really mindful that those high integrity requirements can disproportionately impact on small scale projects. So we really do need these kind of aggregation mechanisms, these kind of centralized or these local sort of centralized delivery mechanisms to deal with some of that impact on behalf of the individual landowners. And also we heard, although it wasn't a particular focus of the project, we heard that as this kind of landscape that we're all working in develops, there is quite a lot of complexity between the different roles of project developers, code owners, and third-party validators and verifiers. And again, that kind of transactional cost, that sort of complexity, does disproportionately impact on small-scale projects. So as I say, we came up with some sort of more detailed recommendations in our final report, but perhaps just to sort of give you 3 take-home messages before we move over to the Q&A. So I guess we were doing a feasibility exercise in this project, and I think we've concluded that aggregation does offer opportunities, but it's not a silver bullet. It won't deal with the scale or the small scale issues, the low capacity of individual landowners in isolation of some more systematic developments that are required both on the supply side and the demand side to basically create more demand that will pull through some of these smaller projects, and also to make sure that on the supply side these requirements and sort of working mechanisms don't disproportionately impact on these smaller scale projects, even if they're aggregated. There's no doubt about it that a whole farm or whole land holding code, or whatever it might be called, would be beneficial. I think that came through very strongly in John's presentation, but it's not clear from the point of view of a 10-month funded project who would own or govern such a code or has got sufficient resource to develop and manage such a code. If you think about the codes that have been put in place so far in this kind of voluntary landscape, they've had significant financial backing and they've had significant institutional backing to get them off the ground. And finally, this, I sort of mentioned it in the earlier conclusions, but Scotland does have this rich resource of local delivery partnerships doing some fantastic work on the ground. And they're well placed, I think, if mobilised by, I guess, the Scottish policy more generally, to support and facilitate this aggregation within that sort of overall context of more supply and demand side measures to support these small scale projects. And therefore get more nature delivery from Scotland's farm landscapes. Okay, as I say, I've been sharing my screen for the last hour, so I haven't stayed in touch at all with the Q&A or the chat, but that's our final slide. I'd just like to say thanks to all of you for listening. It's time for questions now, and also just to mention once again, the funders of this project are Nature Scot and the Heritage Lottery, but also very grateful for the support we've had from the 5 core farmers we've worked with, the Croft case study that we've developed, and all the other stakeholders and representatives that we've engaged with over the last 10 months. Thank you for all your inputs. Okay, I'll stop sharing now. Okay, Johan, I don't know whether you've been able to keep a handle on the Q&A more than I have.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions in there, and Jamie and I have been answering some of them in comments. If everyone can access the Q&A, it should be in the top panel of your screen. You can upvote questions which you'd particularly like answered, because technically speaking, we only have 13 minutes left for questions, but yeah, there's some great questions in here. I don't know if I should just pick out one, or Clive, if you want to have a look.
Yeah, if you're sort of more, because as you say, you've answered some, but I haven't seen the answers, so maybe pick one that's got been upvoted that we haven't responded to yet.
Okay. So one which hasn't been responded to yet, but has been upvoted, is about how we identified or found the farms who participated in the project. Were the farms who participated already planning to use silvopastoral or silvo-arable systems, or were they persuaded to as part of the study?
Okay, well, I think probably both of us could give that a bit of a go. Yeah, and I think you did touch on it a little bit in your sort of introductory remarks on the steps that we undertook. But you know, I guess the context for this is that this is a 10-month project, so not a single tree has been planted during this project timeline, and there's no guarantee that any trees will be planted. But our kind of motivation was to get as rich a data source as we could to do some of the analysis that we've just been presenting to you. So we were keen to work with farmers who were keen to develop relatively ambitious plans for their farms, with the proviso that this is all optional. They don't have to implement any of those plans. It's been, I don't know whether any of the farmers are on the call at the moment, but it's been really interesting to speak to them kind of towards the end of the project. And I think all 5 core farms that we've worked with plan to implement to some extent some of their project, if not all of their project, but maybe not in the next planting season. So we that's one of the ways that we kind of selected the farms that we worked with. Obviously, we were also trying to work within the sort of parameters of small and medium-sized farms. So we sort of made a deliberate decision not to work with what you might classify as estates, where arguably, or many, not all, but some of those estates have already got the kind of capacity and also managing some of these different things through separate enterprises anyway. We wanted to work with this much more at a kind of farming enterprise level.
Mm.
I don't know if you've got anything to add to that. Yeah, Hannah.
Yeah, I'll just mention that some of the farms we already had existing relationships with, either through the Soil Association Exchange or through the Woodland Trust. One of the farms is also part of the Northwoods Rewilding Network, so was already quite set up and yeah, focused on bringing more natural capital into their land through interventions like tree planting. Yeah, and then we did show one farm which has already implemented the silvoarable system. And there was another farm which was was just taking over from their father and was interested in yeah, diversifying a little bit more. So hopefully that's answered that question.
Okay. I'm struggling to see where the questions have been answered, but there is this question from Laura James that's got 3 thumbs up about other opportunities beyond carbon. Is that one?
Yep, that's been upvoted. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, I mean, just to comment on that to start with, again, the sort of context of this is a 10-month project. But what we did try to do, and I think this touches on some of the other questions that have been posed in the Q&A as well. Although the focus has been on carbon in terms of being able to do the sort of financial cash flows and using the existing codes and the methodologies that have been developed, the reason that we run this through Soil Association Exchange's platform is to try and get that wider perspective on the other impacts that these natural capital projects could develop or deliver over time. So one of the impact areas there is biodiversity. One of the impact areas is social, including food production, and also kind of water management. Now, it wasn't possible to, again, within the sort of context of a 10-month project, to be able to sort of develop any quantitative understanding of what the uplifts might be from these projects on those individual farms. But the whole point of working with the farmers in the way that we did, the way the Woodland Trust worked, Ian's team, and also the way the Soil Association team worked, was to make sure that all of these proposals were integrated with the farming system to avoid significant trade-off with any food production. In fact, most of it was still targeted at marginal areas. It's also one of the reasons why there was quite a focus on agroforestry and the idea that that might actually deliver more impact and more production per hectare than a single land use. So it just wasn't possible to kind of develop that in any detail. But I don't know whether any of my colleagues, Jamie, is that something that you might want to comment on from a sort of wider Finance Earth perspective?
Hi, Clive. There's not a huge amount more I'd actually add on to there. There are other schemes, and we're aware of sort of other schemes operating which are looking at the broader perspective. But in the context of this one, again, within the focus of this project and the timeline, we had to keep it quite constrained to the carbon opportunity.
Okay. So Helen Glass has asked a different sort of question, which is about were we able to do any work with potential sort of actors on the demand side, so either supply chains or retailers, who might be the target customers for this approach. And again, not in a specific way in terms of these individual 5 projects that we've presented to you, but some of the sort of more detailed conclusions that we get into in the final report are effectively along the lines of whether or not there would be some sort of market differentiation for this type of natural capital uplift that might particularly be of interest to supply chains. So either as a kind of insetting model or as a sort of offsetting model. But again, that's sort of work to be done, I think, in terms of kind of developing this concept and whether or not it is possible to create a sort of differentiated unit in the market. Again, Jamie, that might be something that you've got a wider perspective on from a Finance Earth perspective.
Yeah. So clearly, what has been transpiring in the market is people have been sort of selling carbon plus added benefits or implied other added benefits. And this could be charismatic carbon and other sort of opportunities. So, or there's the wilder carbon framework, which is carbon plus biodiversity. So the thesis still stands that from corporates looking to engage in a whole farm and accept that it may be harder to substantiate what the co-benefits are, that from a more ESG or CSR, so corporate sustainability engagement perspective, there could be the opportunity to sell a premium credit, but further work would be needed to substantiate and evidence this. We didn't get around to achieving that in this during the duration of this project. And it'll be interesting to see how the market develops over the coming years in terms of bundling and other opportunities.
Okay. Any other questions, Johanna, that you're thinking we haven't tackled yet?
There was one question which was raised quite early on in the presentation from PJ, and I think it's been brought up again by Miranda about the carbon sequestration in grassland soils and how this might impact the overall value of the carbon. I mentioned that it's not strictly included in the exchange platform and hasn't been included in this analysis. Jamie mentioned also that there's no government-backed code around this. So, and since we were focusing on the existing codes where carbon units can be generated, this wasn't the focus, but maybe someone else in the panel.
Well, I think what we can say about the soil carbon is that so both within the Woodland Carbon Code currently and also the prototype agroforestry carbon calculator that was developed, which under the NERF project, which we used in this project, they both take into account, they basically adopt the same methodology within the Woodland Carbon Code in terms of either emissions from soil disturbance, tree planting, or accumulation of carbon in soils in silvo-arable systems. But we didn't look at the obviously that is a very valid point that you could look at the wider soil carbon as a whole farm approach. But as you've just said, Johanna, that was not something within the scope of this project. Within a 10-month project, there's a whole team of people who've been looking at the idea of developing a soil carbon code for a much longer period than we had. So we had to sort of draw the boundaries somewhere and didn't scope that in.
Clive just confirmed that the analysis we did didn't cover the inter-row cropping carbon between the silvo-arable at Park Hill. So the 30 meters of inter-row cropping, we calculated the carbon density in the hedge and sorry, in the hedges and the agroforestry strips, but not the inter-row cropping.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, yeah, I think like carbon measurement taken from the soil over several decades, I think it's quite laborious to do that and to confirm, and carbon in the soil fluctuates a lot more than it does in the woodlands. So yeah, that was just another reason, another complication factor which warranted it not to be included in this analysis. But yeah, I'm sure there are other studies out there which speak to the trade-offs that might occur as a result of tree planting for high carbon soils. And then there was one more question from Celine, which I'm not sure if that's been answered explicitly, about the whole farm approach, considering that we focused on mostly woody interventions. So the question was around, that we had potentially had quite a limited view on both whole farm and natural capital. And the question was whether wider farming system benefits were discussed with farmers.
Well, I think I did try to answer that in my sort of earlier response. Really, that's the whole reason that we worked in a partnership with the individual farmers to discuss and develop the plans kind of in a co-production way, but also the reason that we use the Soil Association Exchange platform, which does allow you to at least baseline some of these other impacts, albeit not necessarily scenario project what the future uplifts will be. I think I think we probably sort of need to leave it there, that this is a sort of feasibility project to try and bring alive what a whole farm approach might look like. But of course, it would need a lot more development to sort of bring this reality and to reality and put this out there as either a code or a sort of way of working. But hopefully the final report and the sort of project conclusions give enough of a sort of next steps approach to how some of this might be taken forward. I'm going to have to wrap it up there. There are a couple of comments in the Q&A about the final report and some of the other sort of information that we presented. It will, and just to reassure, at the moment it's with Nature Scott and Heritage Lottery. We're responding to some feedback, but we will be making available on the Soil Association website on behalf of all the partners the final report and some of the other outputs. And we'll make sure that everybody from this webinar gets a sort of direct contact as to when that's gone live. Okay, we're a bit over time now, and I can see people have started to drift off, understandably. But yeah, just to thank you all once again for your attention and participation, and to thank my colleagues for co-presenting the results from our project over the last hour and a half. Thank you.